Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks Manuela for inviting me, and also thanks University of St. Andrews and the Scottish Esperanto Association for giving me the opportunity to present my work. So I prepared more or less like a 45-minute talk, if that's okay for you. I'm going to share my slides with you, and then we can go through some questions and answers or organize a debate after that. I can't see the chat. So if you want to ask me questions during the presentation, that's totally fine. If you want to say something and interrupt me, that's okay. But if you write something, I won't be able to read straight away. Let me just double check if the screen is okay here. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's start. So the title of this presentation today is, wait, just a minute. Okay, is We Have Never Been Universal, Speaking Esperanto as a Prefigurative Political Practice in France. As Manuela said, I finished recently, last year, my PhD in social anthropology at the University of Manchester. I started learning Esperanto in 2009, taking face-to-face classes in my hometown in Rio de Janeiro. In the beginning, I thought of Esperanto as a language, and I was curious about how this made-up language worked. Then in my classes, I heard people talking about Esperantujo, the Esperanto community, the Esperanto movement, the Universal Esperanto Association, the Universal Congresses of Esperanto, and all these things that go beyond the language itself made me even more curious. So most of my course mates were working class, and some of them were really poor. So they would probably never travel abroad, never go to any of these universal congresses, never exchange an online message with Esperanto speakers from other countries. So if they only spoke Esperanto with people who had the same mother tongue as them, what was the point of learning a language whose main function is to promote international communication? Thinking about these issues, I decided to study the Esperanto community and the Esperanto movement in my PhD in social anthropology. So in a really simplified way, what's social anthropology? So anthropology is basically the study of how people live in different social and cultural settings around the world and how they make sense of things. It's the study of habits, traditions, values, cultures, religions, political practices, languages, and etc. Usually, historians will explore our past, how we came to be the way we are. And sociologists will look at broader trends in a more quantitative way to explain, for example, what constitutes a crime, what is globalization, and so on. Anthropologists do research through a closer look at how people interact with each other, explaining why they do things the way they do. So, for example, a sociologist studying Esperanto would say that there's this number of Esperanto speakers in the world, this percentage of them are teachers, this percentage are polyglots, and most of them live in such and such countries. Anthropologists don't do quantitative surveys. What we do is called ethnography. We spend a long period of time with a specific group of people, joining their activities and meetings, seeing what they do, what they don't do, why and how. And then we explain in detail what's going on with these specific people. We also complement our work with interviews and archival research to cover some aspects of everyday life that people's practices alone may not cover. Now, about what I'm presenting today. This is only one aspect of my PhD research, as Manuela said, and it's roughly based on one of the chapters of my thesis. And my thesis was about the connections between Esperanto and left-wing politics in France. I spent 13 months living in France in 2016 and 2017, and I stayed for most of this time in Paris to understand how this language came to be associated with radical politics in that country. In Brazil, where I come from, Esperanto is a phenomenon closely related to religion. In England, the links between Esperanto and politics are almost inexistent. But in France, mainly in Paris, being an Esperantist means being engaged in a sometimes serious fight between the neutralists and leftists, and it's sometimes impossible to speak this language without having to take sides. Surprisingly, France was also the first country where Esperanto set foot and took roots in Western Europe, as every historian analyzing Esperanto has stated. In the early 20th century, Esperanto was conveyed, in France as elsewhere, as the universal language that should become widespread all over the world and that would one day become the world's lingua franca. But if Esperanto was created in 1887 and should have become the universal language, this obviously never happened after more than 130 years of existence. This justifies what many non-Esperantists argue when they say Esperanto is a failed project, a thing of the past. But if Esperanto failed, why are there still so many people around the world who speak this language? And why in France do they keep fighting over whether Esperanto should be a neutral language or a tool to promote left-wing political stances? Many academics have researched Esperanto from the perspective of sociology, history, literature studies, and linguistics. But mine is among the first studies of Esperanto based on long-term ethnographic fieldwork, which was the result of my 1 year among Esperanto speakers in Paris. As I said in the beginning, as a disclaimer, this study is not to be generalized, and I'm not trying to paint a general picture of Esperanto here. But my main argument is that an ethnographic perspective can contribute to recast the way in which Esperanto is used to repoliticize the role played by language in activist communication. My talk will be roughly divided in 3 moments. I'll start with a historical overview of how Esperanto came to be perceived as a project with universalist ambitions that depended on the language becoming the world's lingua franca. Then I will narrate one of the weekly meetings at the left-wing Esperanto Association Sat Amicaro to show how this universalist paradigm doesn't explain what's going on among Esperantists in this association, and to suggest an alternative approach to Esperanto through the perspective of everyday prefigurative political practices. I argue that instances of regular use of this language, like the debates run by Sat Amicaro, are widely informed by practices that mobilize the language to create horizontal learning spaces where free speech and inclusive communication can take place, regardless of far-fetched goals related to spreading Esperanto worldwide. Since this talk is not only for an academic audience, I got rid of most of the academic references and arguments that I had in the original version of this presentation. And I also tried to shift the focus of my discussion from anthropology to Esperanto studies. But if things are still unclear, please let me know at the end, and then we can go through things again. So first, let's think about how Esperanto has become a universal language. So 1887, as we all know, this is the year when Zamenhof launched the fundamentals of Esperanto in a booklet in Russian. Many historians, linguists, and biographers of Zamenhof tell us why he decided to create a language and how Esperanto was one among many other languages being constructed during the 19th and 20th centuries. We also know that Zamenhof's motivations to create Esperanto arose from his Jewish identity, from the inequalities, tensions, and lack of dialogue among different national and ethnic groups he saw in Białystok. I won't repeat this story today. What I propose here is an alternative story of Esperanto that answers the following question. After all, how did this language become widespread in Western Europe, mainly in France, in the first years of the 20th century? The late 19th and early 20th centuries were periods of considerable scientific and technological advancement in the West. The decades preceding the First World War were marked by the invention of the telephone, which gradually replaced the telegraph, the development of electric and diesel trains, the flight of the first powered airplane, as well as the popularization of international shipping routes and postal services. Combined, all these advancements reformulated the relationship the Euro-American world had established with time and space, promoting the circulation of people, things, ideas, and information at a pace never seen before. Parallel to this, imperialism expanded European hegemony to the African and Asian continents, reaching its peak in the period between 1875 and 1914. The increase in international traveling and trade caused by the European expansion provided a powerful incentive for the continuous development of communication and transportation technologies that would enable Europeans to more easily and frequently reach the rest of the world. Unsurprisingly, increasing international communication depended not only on means, but also on codes of communication, which brought the issue of language diversity and universality to the forefront of discussions. The overarching image of relentless progress boosted by such inventions in European expansion features among the elements that retrospectively characterized the period preceding the Second World War as La Belle Époque. The European upper middle classes were enjoying a moment of apparent peace and prosperity, partly at the expense of the massive exploitation of resources in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. In a context of growing European nationalism and imperialism, having access to news from around the globe almost in real time and being able to communicate and travel across borders also increased people's curiosity about foreign and unfamiliar populations, raising Europeans' awareness of the world as something larger than their own continent. As technology affected how the world conceived of itself, it also shaped perceptions of how the world should be. The celebration of technological developments, nationalism, and people's increasing curiosity about national, ethnic, and cultural diversity took center stage at the Universal Exhibitions. Originally taking place in London in 1851, the Universal Exhibitions came to be held regularly, each time in a different city across the globe. These world fairs were monumental displays of human progress, civilization, and innovation, and counted with national and colonial pavilions showing what each country had to offer in terms of culture and technology. As these fairs were laboratories of what the world could be like in the future, the technologies displayed in these exhibitions were expected to be widely adopted worldwide and consequently becoming universal. For instance, this one in the photo is the Chicago's exhibition of 1893. And this one was proud of being the first large-scale venue powered with an alternating current electrical system. And also the Eiffel Tower was inaugurated as a new metal-based construction technique for the Paris exhibition of 1889. These world fairs were meant to advertise not only goods, but also ideas. And these displays also conveyed particular Western values as proxies for modernity and human progress. So if progress involved creating a more interconnected world, in which languages should these intercultural encounters be carried out? For example, when journalists from different countries lifted the receiver from the telephone hook to exchange news, or when business people and travelers across national borders on speedy diesel trains, in which language would they speak to achieve their communicative purposes? A key acknowledgement of this issue came with the establishment of the Delegation for the Adoption of an International Auxiliary Language, an outcome of the Paris Universal Exhibition in the first year of the 20th century. With universal emerging as the catchword of the time, nations and corporations promoted their cultures and technologies as assets to be universalized, while various groups were also creating universal codes of communication. While one proposed solution to this perceived communication problem was the international use of a national language, with, for example, French or English becoming the world's lingua franca, another option was the creation of a new language to be used exclusively for international purposes. As we all know, language creation was an old activity, having been widely documented since at least the 17th century. But among countless language projects, the one that gained the most attention were the international auxiliary languages created in the late 19th century. They were set to enable communication among people who did not share the same mother tongue, and among these languages, Esperanto emerged as the most successful and long-lasting of them. In the early years of Esperanto, most of the communication in the language took place through postal correspondence and later through face-to-face communication in local, national, and international Esperanto meetings. Reaching Western Europe, the universalist paradigm set by the universal exhibitions by the Belle Époque and attempts to universalize the technological and cultural achievements of the West provided a solid ground for Esperanto to take roots. The growing idea of using Esperanto to advance modern science and commerce at the continental and global level then took shape through the organization of Universal Congresses of Esperanto and the institutionalization of the Universal Esperanto Association. And with them, we have these images of people trying to embrace the word and to communicate across borders and in a way to make it widespread. Whether as a peace-promoting project or as a bastion of science and business, Esperanto was quickly added to the plethora of inventions from the late 19th century with universalist ambitions. These included expanding the Western views of progress, as well as the use of languages like Esperanto worldwide as a lingua franca for the world. With this, the perception of Esperanto as a would-be universal language was born, and its image as a universalist project was coined. This image persists to date, as the Oxford English Dictionary illustrates in defining Esperanto as an artificial language invented for universal use. Together with any other universalist project from that time, Esperanto's success was conditioned upon its worldwide spread and wide use for many communicative purposes. This, as we know, became the dream and the project of the so-called Finvenkistoj, those who advanced the final victory of Esperanto, or in other words, the materialization of this universalist project. As I showed before, Esperanto gained momentum among the intellectuals and elites in Western Europe during the times of the Belle Époque. But then the First War came and this scenario changed. The European perception of progress and modernity, epitomized by the universal exhibitions, collapsed, and the idea of universalism lost momentum. These changing circumstances were followed by a strengthening of the use of Esperanto by the working classes, anarchists, communists, and pacifists. In sum, those who were against both the war and the nationalist issues that led to it. These groups found in Esperanto a tool to communicate their political convictions and to create an international forum where like-minded proletarians and lay people could advance the international class struggle. This was responsible for a certain expansion of Esperanto, but later for its decline, since many countries shut down Esperanto clubs and associations accused of anti-patriotism. A major opportunity of recognition appeared with the creation of the League of Nations in 1920 and its subsequent replacement with the United Nations. With the Universal Esperanto Association urging the UN to endorse Esperanto, UNESCO presented a resolution in 1954 recognizing UEA as an organization in consultative relations with the UN and UNESCO. Despite this status, these international bodies never explicitly encouraged the spread of the language. Later, during the Cold War, Esperanto presented itself as a more politically neutral alternative to Russian and English, the two competing imperialist languages at the time of tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. However, the end of this conflict undermines this sound argument about Esperanto's neutrality. These ebbs and flows and short-lived occasions of relative success produced the generalized perception of Esperanto as a language that failed to take hold. What is more, political opportunities to advance Esperanto became scarce after the Cold War. While issues like armed conflicts or climate change require quick mobilization to solve a pressing issue conveyed as urgent, a cause linked to international, egalitarian, and inclusive communication is unlikely to require an immediate response. As a consequence, The shortage of critical occasions for mobilization makes the Esperanto movement continuously struggle to situate its cause at the topic of political agendas. This image of Esperanto failing to find an effective political momentum and to secure stable support is reinforced by academic approaches to the Esperanto community and movement. Historians like Ulrich Linz show how Esperanto was depicted in certain periods of the 20th century as, as an enemy of the state, when Esperanto speakers were persecuted by totalitarian regimes on the European continent. In a similar way, Miller and Benton and Ripley show how the Chinese and Japanese governments came to perceive Esperanto as dangerous in the early 20th century, with the language being associated with communism, anarchism, and opposition to traditional national values. Against this background, the political relevance of Esperanto in the 21st century appears to be less manifest. As present-day Esperantists are rarely persecuted or seen as threats, the groups that currently compose the Esperanto movement are not often regarded as, paraphrasing the sociologist Charles Tilly, credible collective actors that could disrupt existing political arrangements. And this disempowers Esperanto and its political and radical potential. Sociological studies focusing on surveys and statistical data about membership in Esperanto associations end up conveying a similar feeling of decline. Nicolas Rajic, for example, who wrote the most comprehensive quantitative survey of Esperantists ever made, associates the vitality of the language movement with membership in Esperanto associations. So when he analyzes Esperanto associations in many countries, mostly in Europe, throughout the 20th century, one of his findings is that these associations have a much higher proportion of older members than of young people. If, as he argues, the constant absence of young speakers poses a challenge to the continuity of Esperanto associations, his conclusion is that the progress and future of Esperanto is always uncertain. And there's also Peter Foster, who surveyed the members of the Esperanto Association of Britain in the late 60s. One of his key arguments was that in the early 20th century, members of this association felt that the language was reaching its peak and were motivated to speak and promote it. But, quoting him, already in 1936, the question, is Esperanto still alive? I never heard about it, is suggested as commonplace. The well-established definition of Esperanto as a universal language led to the commonplace perception that Esperanto's success depends on its becoming widely spoken worldwide and effectively universal. Such bold expectations of achievement irrevocably label the Esperanto movement as a failure, a perception that is reinforced by academic approaches that subject Esperanto success to its victory over other languages. And here I bring a quote from the sociologist Roberto Gavia. Although Esperanto prevailed among the crowded and fractious field of artificial languages, it failed to become the international auxiliary language that many expected. The movement reached its peak in the mid-20s, but only 10 years later, Esperanto's prospects were rather bleak. It had defeated rival artificial languages, but lost the war against natural languages, in particular English, to become the world's lingua franca. But the assumption that Esperanto's success depends on its triumph as a universal language assumes that the history of Esperanto is necessarily the history of linguistic battles. But what if most Esperanto speakers were not fighting this war in the first place? So let's pause this digression for a while. Here, now I'll bring my ethnographic material with a description of one of the debates I attended at Satemikaro, a left-wing Esperanto association created in 1945 in Paris, to show how this universalist paradigm does not explain what I found during my year-long fieldwork in France. So this is the headquarters of Satemikaro. On a Friday evening in late October 2016, these issues we've just discussed seem far from relevant for the 17 people gathered for the regular debate at Satemikaro around this table. The theme of the discussion in Esperanto that evening was labor. Is it the same as before? Are there still workers in the world to be united? Who still enjoys working and under what conditions? As the participants arrived, greeted each other, and sat down at the table, the discussion slowly began. Idris, a middle-aged Tunisian computer scientist, started the debate in a quite philosophical way, saying that nothing's work and nothing could be seen as work. In his view, working for a corporation, helping people on the streets, and accomplishing tasks at home are all part of our daily lives and should be seen as tasks, not as obligations, so not as work. Despite his confident tone, his viewpoint met with the disapproval of Valentin, a former Yugoslavian citizen who has for long living in the suburbs of Paris. Valentin spent many years working in many positions in various functions before retirement, which showed him that work could not be romanticized in that way. With a gesture of dismissal, he raised his voice and said, "Be realistic, I didn't come here to hear this. If there were, and there are still, slaves in the world, how can you believe that work is this good?" Trying to reconcile both sides, Marcel, a retired accountant who was the treasurer of Satemikaro, partially agreed with Idris, but turned his argument upside down. Instead of nothing being work, for Marcel, everything was work. Instead of nothing being work, for Marcel, everything was work. Work can also be, but not necessarily exhaustive, exploitative, and unfairly paid with money. And everything we do is work, and then I bring his quote. "Even if I'm retired, I'm the treasurer of the association, and I consider this to be work. Everything we do is work, and that means that working is not necessarily good or bad. It may become problematic if we do it only for money, without enjoying or seeing the purpose of what we do, or if we are exploited by big corporations. And these are the cases that require us to fight. But I'm glad that there have been alternatives lately. There's this system nowadays called CEL. Have you heard of it? It means Système d'échange locaux, where work is remunerated with time, not money. Minutes are their money rather than euros and cents, and people's skills are recognized based on their abilities to accomplish tasks and help other people, not based on diplomas." Marcel continued to explain how exchange trading systems work, saying that society convinces people without degrees that they are unskilled and useless, but in fact, everyone can be useful and participate by, for example, painting a wall, cutting someone's hair, or teaching a language. This made Valentin smile, recalling the good old solidarity he had seen during Tito's time in Yugoslavia. Idris, who had heard of exchange systems but did not know how they worked, asked several questions about how labor is remunerated and traded. And most of the debate that followed was on how everyone's work has the same value with the system, since these grassroots initiatives are based on egalitarian exchanges of the time devoted to performing each activity. Surprised to learn about CEL, Pascal, a middle-aged civil servant from the French Ministry of Agriculture, asked Marcel how he knew so much about it. Seizing the opportunity to display his libertarian lifestyle, Marcel smiled and told us about how he, his co-dwellers, and friends use the system in the daily functioning of the commune where he and his wife live, in which they grow food, cook, pay bills, organize political meetings, and make decisions collectively. Some participants took notes, while others occasionally joined the discussion with brief comments. Meanwhile, Gilbert, a 50-year-old civil servant at the post office, enthusiastically whispered to me, who was sitting by his side at the long table, about how systems like CEL could make Europe a better place. A restless defender of European federalism, Gilbert always concentrated on how the results of our discussions could contribute to European integration. Unlike Gilbert, and this is the part that gets interesting because then we get into each of the participants of the discussion. Because unlike Gilbert, the other participants were not aligned with federalism. Marcel was proud of his libertarian practices and of the fact that despite voting in the French and European elections, he had never joined any political party. He was also an active member of ATTAC, an organization that supports social, political, and environmental practices opposed to neoliberal globalization. Valentin, in turn, often recalled Tito's Yugoslavia with nostalgia, which has dissuaded him from supporting the French Communist Party. Pascal, on the other hand, lived in the wealthy 15e arrondissement and participated in a project in his neighborhood in which French citizens helped refugees with their asylum applications and job searches. Finally, Idriss did not want to be associated with any political stance, but was particularly concerned with fair communication and language rights, which had led him to develop a cued speech system for Esperanto, to help a deaf-mute Esperanto learner in Paris to communicate in the language. Starting at 6:30 p.m., the debate continued for over 4 hours, shifting between serious arguments and informal conversations about everyday topics. However, although carried out entirely in Esperanto, nothing in that debate was about Esperanto. If the participants had different perspectives about politics, but all shared the same interest in the language, shouldn't they also consider what kind of work they should engage with in their activism for Esperanto? The debate participants were not discussing strategies to promote the language, nor trying to push Esperanto as an agenda. They were simply speaking the language. If all of us that evening could speak French fluently, and most of us were French nationals, why were we not speaking in French? How could the paradigm that labels Esperanto as a universalist project explain why people would go to an Esperanto association to have a debate about labor, work, and remuneration? Why not discuss the same topic in another social movement or association, like at ATTAC or even at Martial's Commune? So my suggestion is, what if we use this ethnographic account as a starting point to understand everyday ways of using the language? And my argument is that this is where Esperanto as a universalist project makes room for Esperanto as a prefigurative political practice. So SAT and Satamikaro aim to encourage the use of Esperanto among the working classes, lay people, and those holding radical political convictions. For this reason, these associations' activities are oriented towards issues and themes that could appeal to people with these profiles. During the intermediate level Esperanto classes at Satamikaro, held on Tuesday afternoons, Dominique, the volunteer responsible for this class, taught grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation for half an hour. He then devoted the remaining 90 minutes to examining a one-page text, asking how his students should find linguistic mistakes added to it on purpose. The texts he brought from Esperanto magazines had either been originally written in Esperanto or translated from other languages. However, they were always about what he called political issues, which included equality and equity, discrimination, alternative currencies, freedom of speech, and religious controversies. If Esperanto, at first glance, is at the core of the activities at Satamikaro, it quickly falls behind as the content of the political discussions gains prominence. Among Dominique's 7 regular students, whose ages ranged from 24 to 80 years old, 6 identified with the French Communist Party or with associations, social movements, and NGOs linked to the fight for social justice. As Dominique brought readings on contentious topics to the classroom, he used his students' eagerness to join in with these political discussions as a motivation for them to learn faster. While his classes, free of charge for association members, were for intermediate learners, the debate group was open to members and non-members of all levels. Initially revolving around the use of the language, every gathering at Satamikaro quickly became a heated political discussion. As libertarians, communists, federalists, language rights and social justice supporters, and non-aligned left-leaning participants got together, Esperanto became a tool for them to partake of the same space for discussion, without sharing the same thoughts about the discussed themes. Both Dominique's classes and the debate group provided their participants with safe spaces for them not only to learn the language, but also learn about politics. These practices of informal learning are in line with those that direct action activists employ widely within social movements that fight neoliberal globalization, like the Occupy movements, the Extinction Rebellion in the UK, and the Gilets jaunes in France. The activists that join these movements often oppose the mainstream mass media and the idea of political representation, and they practice what they preach by promoting activist communication that empowers everyone to have a saying and that creates space for marginalized minorities to express themselves and to take action, regardless of the support of the majority. Going back to Satemikaro, the debate group turns the association's headquarters into a welcoming and inclusive learning space, where Esperantists use the language to promote more egalitarian communicative exchanges, which in turn is a key component of their political practice. The Esperanto language sets the frame of the debate, establishing a relatively hierarchy-free democratic setting where they collaborate, learn together, and have access to first-hand information. This takes place not as a passive learning process, but through practices in which they express themselves freely and their points of view are heard, valued, debated, and taken seriously. The information conveyed by journalists and broadcasters at TV channels and newspapers is expected to be supported by evidence and expert knowledge. At Satemikaro, by contrast, the fact that the debate participants are not required to have expert knowledge of the topic encourages them to filter the information they receive via mainstream newspapers and TV channels through their perspectives and political convictions. In line with the inclusiveness associated with Esperanto, these debates succeed in materializing instances of fair and more egalitarian communication through bringing together people from different national and linguistic backgrounds, social classes, occupations, and political orientations to productively and freely debate political issues. This happens through horizontal learning, which turns their Esperanto language practice into one component among many others in this space that allows their knowledge to flow. The particular contribution of Esperanto to horizontal learning lies in the increased attention this language draws to the democratic, more egalitarian, and inclusive use of codes and means of communication. In the case of Idris, for example, after regularly participating in these debates for almost 5 years, his engagement with Esperanto has raised his awareness of language rights and communication issues. This led him to study the basics of French Sign Language, which culminated in the cued speech system he developed for Esperanto. Moreover, 2 months before I left Paris, Idris had started to study and practice techniques of nonviolent communication. Meanwhile, studying Esperanto encouraged Pascal to pay particular attention to language diversity in his voluntary work with refugees. Although learning French is essential for the refugees he supports to navigate their asylum claim processes, what most concerns Pascal is the feeling of isolation that prevails among migrants who only speak minority languages. Since learning French takes time, they often struggle to find fellow speakers and to have meaningful conversations once they are in France. Since not everyone at Satemikaro has French as their first language, which in the debate I described included Valentin, Idris, and I, debating in Esperanto comes closer to what communication on an equal footing would be like. As Esperanto is no one's mother tongue, speaking it requires everyone to go through a comparable language learning process. Also, the absence of people with Esperanto as their first language challenges the hierarchy that places the native speaker as the authority in language matters. This disempowerment of the commonplace language authority makes language discrimination out of place in Esperanto meetings, making communication welcoming also to those who are not confident about their language skills. Interestingly, the language labeled as universal turns out to achieve its full relevance in numerically and spatially limited frameworks, like an association office in Paris. Linking this with the historical aspects we discussed earlier, we can have a question from this. If Esperanto seems to find its ultimate expression in the ordinary creation of horizontal learning spaces, then how can this language use possibly advance Esperanto as a universalist project? The disparity between universalist ambitions and the regular use of the language is what makes the concept of prefiguration meaningful here. Starting from a simple example and running the risk of oversimplifying things, let's think about the movement for the independence of Scotland, or about the movement for the reunification of Korea, or movements that defend socialism. These are classified as traditional social movements that target the state. Their goals are only reached if they manage to convince the state to change a certain law, to adopt a new political system, or to get rid of a certain state to create their own independent country. My argument is that academics cannot analyze the entirety of the Esperanto movement in the same way they study these traditional social movements. What people at Satamikaro are doing, for example, is to practice the language as a way for them to learn from each other, to widen their perspectives about life, and to connect with people from different backgrounds they would never meet otherwise. If we think of Esperanto as a conversational political practice, then we get closer to what prefiguration is. It's not about having a clear macro-political goal, like Esperanto has to be advanced and has to become the world's lingua franca. It's about working on a smaller scale, reaching out to a more limited group of people through ordinary practices of exchanging ideas about politics, life, each other's mother tongues, or anything else. So our Esperantists at Satamikaro discussing labor were not proposing an entirely new division of labor. They were not trying to change the world, nor to advance Esperanto. They were just exchanging ideas by using a language that they see as more egalitarian and inclusive. They are prefiguring the kind of communicative exchange they want. They are activists insofar as they take speaking as a political practice. And they base their practice on horizontal learning as a way to create environments in which everyone can join in the conversation on equal terms, irrespective of national background, expertise on a certain topic, educational level, social class, mother tongue, communication disability, or political stance. By being no one's first language, Esperanto creates a space that belongs to no one, and therefore that can be occupied by everyone, under the condition that all the interested parties undergo the process of learning the language. The shift I'm suggesting here from an approach guided by the universalist paradigm to an emphasis on the significance of Esperanto for ordinary small-scale practices doesn't correspond to a historical shift. It doesn't mean that in the early days, Esperanto had universalist ambitions of becoming the world's lingua franca and now has resigned this role, so to speak. Let's take some actions of UEA as an example of this prefigurative functioning of the language over time. Peter Foster and Ulrich Linz remind us that during the First World War, UEA took advantage of the neutrality of Switzerland, where the association was located, to act as a hub that forwarded family correspondence between people living in countries hostile to each other. Those who were unable to exchange letters directly due to censorship or to the blocking of correspondence coming from enemy countries could send their letters in any language to UEA, who would forward them to the final addressee. And this is one more way of doing what they want without having to think about long-term goals. The philosopher Bruno Latour wrote a book called We Have Never Been Modern, where he affirms that the separation between nature and society pursued by modern science as the ultimate feature that characterized modernity has never effectively taken place. Through a very distinct argument, but perhaps reaching a not so different conclusion, Esperanto has never been primarily and solely universalist, nor universal. Focusing on the universalist ambitions that early Esperantists associated with the language and that non-Esperantists projected onto it, casts a shadow on the way Esperanto speakers and supporters make this language meaningful through everyday practices. From forwarding correspondence in wartime to creating inclusive environments where free speech can be currently carried out, Esperantist practices and orientations have blended prefigurative and universalist practices, with its prefigurative features making the language fully operational, regardless of its universal use. Let's think about some questions frequently asked to Esperantists or to academics researching Esperanto. How many people speak this language? With the emergence of online language courses and social media, is Esperanto more or less widespread and widely spoken than, let's say, 30 years ago? These are questions that matter to Esperanto associations and publishers who rely on membership fees and sales to justify the continuation of their activities. But these are not among the concerns of people like Pascal, Idris, or Marcel. For what they do Esperanto, large attendances at their debate group are not as important as the quality of their discussions and what they learn. Addressing the Esperanto movement from the perspective of universalism has resulted in us thinking of Esperanto ultimately as a project deeply rooted in modernism, with ambitions of becoming the world's lingua franca. Through this lens, we logically conclude that its current speakers are outcasts, a self-selected minority who support a cause that has failed to achieve its objectives. Yet, a closer look at instances of ordinary language use unveils a different scenario, in which Esperanto becomes relevant to its speakers as a more open-ended achievement. From this viewpoint, the Esperanto movement appears outside the framework of success and failure. Instead, it emerges as a tool that repoliticizes and brings back to the discussion the role played by languages in inclusive communication, and that overlooks universalist ambitions and the constant promotion of the language in and of itself. In approaching this movement through these prefigurative features, rather than the commonplace universalist paradigm, I suggest that being part of the Esperanto movement means regularly speaking the language as a political practice. In opening an alternative way to look at this language movement, I hope to show that in the prefigurative practice of Esperantists, what matters is not replacing English or conquering the world, but keeping the conversation going. Thank you.